Before we dive into tonight's haunting story, be sure to like and subscribe, or you may find yourself wondering if something is watching you. Hit that button if you dare. It was a typical Wednesday evening when I walked into the prep room, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their harsh glow a constant companion. There's a rhythm to this work, one that settles into your bones after years of preparation. Gloves on, tools in place, body on the table. And then, of course, the silence. But every now and then, the silence breaks. The body had been brought in just after dark, a middle-aged woman. She'd passed away peacefully in her sleep, or so the coroner's report said. No trauma, no foul play. It was supposed to be an easy case, a simple embalming, a quiet night. I remember her face, not because it was remarkable, but because it wasn't. She was in her mid-50s, and I had prepped enough bodies to know that her features didn't stand out. Soft, peaceful, her skin still holding the faint warmth of the life she had once carried. But as I worked, something didn't sit right. It wasn't her face or her body, it was the room. I started with the basics: washing, prepping, then setting the body for arterial injection. As I worked, I kept hearing a soft sound, a faint scraping, like nails on a surface. I looked up from my work, expecting to see a tool fall or a corner shift, but nothing was out of place. The scraping continued, though slow and deliberate, as if someone was dragging something across the floor. I paused, waiting, listening, but the sound stopped just as abruptly as it had started. I shook it off. Maybe it was the ventilation, I told myself, or the shift in pressure. I continued with my work, but that nagging feeling never left. After a while, I completed the arterial and the body was still lifeless, as it should be. But as I worked to position her hands, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. One of her fingers, just one, was twitching. At first, I thought it was a muscle twitch, something that happens when the body is embalmed. But it wasn't that. The movement was purposeful, deliberate, as if she were trying to grasp something. I froze, staring at her hand, watching the single finger move slightly, then stop. I didn't know what to think. Was it a spasm? A muscle release? I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it, but as I did, I felt the room grow colder. The air around me shifted, growing dense, heavy. The flickering of the overhead lights caught my attention, but I dismissed it. I didn't have time to entertain these ideas. I had a job to do. I finished preparing the body and began to close up. That's when I heard it again, the scraping sound. Only this time, it wasn't faint. It was louder, more urgent, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I turned around, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing, just the body, still on the table, and the oppressive silence that clung to the room. I took a step back, my heart racing, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Then, as if the room itself were holding its breath, the body shifted. Just a slight tilt, not much, but enough to make my stomach flip. Her head, which had been resting at an angle, seemed to lift ever so slightly, as if she were trying to look up at me. The sound of her finger twitching was louder now, and I saw it. Her fingers were curled slightly, as though she were reaching for something. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining this. This was real. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't the superstitious type, but I felt as though the room itself was pressing in on me. I backed away from the table, my mind racing for an explanation, but none came. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It had been over 2 hours since I started Nothing should have been moving. I told myself it was a trick of the light or an illusion caused by my exhaustion, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The scraping sound stopped again, but the room felt different, alive, somehow. As I stood there, frozen, I realized I wasn't alone. The quiet, sterile room that had always been my sanctuary now felt oppressive. I felt watched, as if something was lurking in the corners, just beyond my sight. I turned to the body again. This time, I saw it more clearly. Her eyes, they weren't closed all the way. Her eyelids had been gently set in place earlier, but now, they seemed to be shifting, twitching, almost as if she were trying to open them. I moved closer, unable to tear my eyes away from the small, unsettling movement. Suddenly, her mouth twitched, just a little. I jumped back, heart racing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't how it worked. I checked her again, moving over the body with mechanical precision, hoping to find a logical explanation. But there was nothing, no explanation that made sense. The door to the prep room opened, and my assistant stepped inside. He looked at me, eyes wide, face pale. "What's going on?" he asked. His voice shook, and I knew it wasn't just me who felt it. I looked at him, struggling to find words. But then, the scraping sound started again, this time louder, almost deafening. My assistant took a step back, eyes darting around the room. "It's her, isn't it?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's still here." I couldn't respond. I didn't know how. All I could hear was the scraping. It filled the room, louder now, like a relentless, haunting whisper. Then, in a low, guttural voice that sent chills down my spine, I heard a single word. It wasn't from my assistant. It wasn't from me. It wasn't from the dead woman on the table. It came from the walls. "Help!" I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. My assistant ran for the door, but before he could make it, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint, dim glow from the hallway. In that silence, I knew the body had never truly left, and neither had the fear that it carried. When the power finally returned, the body was still silent, but the air in the room was different. The feeling of being watched was gone, but the dread lingered. I never spoke about it to anyone, not to my assistant, not to the family, not to anyone who walked through those doors. But every now and then, when the lights flicker or the silence grows too thick, I feel it again. That scraping sound, and the word, help. Sometimes, the dead don't stay gone. Sometimes, they find a way to speak. It was supposed to be a routine case. Nothing unusual, just another one of those late-night removals. The kind where you don't expect anything out of the ordinary. The call had come in just as the sun was setting. The kind of soft, fading light that makes everything feel a little unreal. A man mid-40s found dead in his apartment. He hadn't shown up for work for a few days, so his neighbors grew concerned. They called the police, and when they arrived, the man was already gone. No signs of foul play, just a lonely death in a rundown building. His name was James. Nothing particularly remarkable about him, except that his neighbors described him as the kind of man who kept to himself, quiet, withdrawn. I didn't think much of it when we took him in. Standard procedure. The body was cold, pale, and lifeless, the way you expect a body to look after a few days without care. But as soon as I placed him on the prep table, something felt off. It wasn't the smell, no. The usual combination of decomposition and antiseptic was there. But there was something else. A faint, musty odor, almost like mold, clung to the man. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unsettling. I tried to ignore it. I had a job to do. The body was in pretty rough shape. He'd been lying in that apartment, unmoved, for days. His skin had that ashen quality, dry and brittle, and his lips had started to curl from dehydration. I prepped him for embalming, making sure to follow every procedure as usual. But as I worked, I kept hearing a faint sound. At first I thought it was just the hum of the machines, or the scrape of my tools against his body. But then, it came again, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching. I paused, my hand stilling on the neck of the syringe. I listened. Silence. I had chalked it up to my tired mind playing tricks, and I carried on. But then it happened again. The scratching, more deliberate this time. I looked down at the body. His arms were at his sides, perfectly still. Nothing had moved, but the sound. It continued, coming from somewhere in the room. I took a deep breath and turned to check the equipment. Everything was in place. There was no reason for the sound. The scraping continued, slow, rhythmic, like the faintest whisper of fingernails against wood. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but I ignored it. It's just an old building, I thought. The floors creak, the walls settle. It was nothing. But then, I noticed something that made my heart skip. The man's hand. His fingers were twitching, ever so slightly, just enough to catch my attention. I took a step closer, leaning over the table to get a better look. His hand hadn't moved before. It had been resting flat at his side, like all the others. But now, it was curling inwards, almost like it was trying to grasp something. I froze. This couldn't be happening. The body was in full rigor mortis. There was no way his muscles could move. I backed away from the table, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? The scratching came again, louder now, more pronounced. My heart was thumping in my chest as I turned towards the door. I had to get out of here. I needed a break. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. A voice faint, but unmistakable. Please. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The man's mouth wasn't moving, but the words were clear as day. Please. The room felt colder, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I glanced back at the body, unable to move. unsure of what I was seeing. His fingers were now curled completely, tightly, like he was grasping for something, anything. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to, but I had to. I approached the table again, my hand shaking as I reached for the man's wrist. His skin was ice cold, his pulse There was no way for his body to react, not like this. But as my fingers brushed his skin, the air shifted. The pressure in the room seemed to build, like the walls were closing in. The strange scratching sound escalated, reverberating off the sterile walls. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the room swirling with confusion and fear. Then, the lights flickered. A low buzz filled the room, almost like the hum of a dying machine. And just as suddenly as it started, the body jolted just once. A sharp movement, like a tremor, and then everything stopped. The lights flickered back on. The air felt normal again, and the temperature in the room returned to its usual sterile chill. But the man's hand, his fingers were now open, lying flat on the table once more, as if nothing had ever happened. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to finish this. I had to get through it. I told myself it was just fatigue, stress. I was imagining things. But as I continued the embalming process, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I finished up the job quickly, sealing the casket and preparing the body for viewing. When the family arrived, I didn't speak much. They were quiet, distant, like they already knew what they would see. They filed in, paid their respects, and left without a word. But as they exited, the woman who had been standing closest to the body paused at the door. She turned to me, eyes wide with something I couldn't place. "Did you hear it?" she asked. "Hear what?" I replied, my voice shaky, more out of exhaustion than anything else. "The scratching," she said softly. "We heard it in the room. Just before we came in. It sounded like something was trying to get out." My breath caught in my throat as the door clicked shut behind them. The air was thick again, and for the first time, I realized that maybe it wasn't just me who had felt it. Just maybe there was something left behind when we left that room. I've never spoken of it to anyone. Not to the family, not to my colleagues. But every now and then, when I'm alone in that prep room, when the lights flicker or the silence presses in too tightly, I hear it again. The scratching. And I know, deep down, it wasn't just the building settling. Something had been left behind. Something that didn't belong there. Something that was trying to reach out. The night was still and quiet when the call came through, just as I was finishing up my shift. The usual way things go quiet until the last minute, and then suddenly there's a body that needs to be processed. A man with no foul play suspected, just another late night case. I arrived at the funeral home to find him already on the gurney, wrapped in a black plastic body bag. His name was Daniel. His family had requested an expedited embalming, as they wanted an open casket service the next morning. No problem, I thought. It would be routine, but there was something about Daniel's body that felt different. The second I opened the bag, I felt it. The air in the prep room shifted, thickened. Not the usual musty, sterile atmosphere. It felt heavier, denser. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been working long hours, but as I laid his body on the table and began my work, I couldn't shake the unease. The man's skin was pale, his features relaxed. He had clearly passed peacefully. His body was stiff, but no more than one would expect. There was nothing particularly unusual about the way he looked. He wasn't bloated or showing signs of decomposition. He had been dead less than 24 hours. Still, something about him seemed off. Something in the way his body lay there, silent and still, like a weight pressing down in the room. I began the embalming process, slowly and methodically. As I injected the solution into his arteries, I noticed something strange. His fingers twitched, just the slightest movement, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I paused, heart racing for a moment, wondering if I'd imagined it. But no, the movement was real. His fingers curled and then relaxed, the same way they might if he were just waking up from sleep. I couldn't explain it. It was impossible. He was dead. There was no way for his fingers to move like that. The rigor mortis had already set in, but the twitching continued. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic. As I worked, his hand twitched every few seconds, curling inwards, then relaxing, like he was trying to reach for something. I tried to focus on my work, trying to convince myself that it was some sort of muscle spasm, maybe caused by the embalming fluid, or a reflex that hadn't fully passed. But the longer I worked, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just a twitch, it was deliberate, intentional. And then, as I repositioned his hand to fold it over his chest, it happened again. His fingers curled so tightly that they pressed into the palm of his hand, almost as if he were gripping something. I pulled my hand back, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. This wasn't supposed to happen. Bodies didn't move like this, but Daniel's fingers were moving. I looked around the room, trying to steady myself. I glanced at the door to make sure I wasn't being watched. The last thing I needed was for someone to catch me standing there, paralyzed by fear, while I worked on a corpse. As I went back to the task at hand, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint whisper, barely audible, but distinct. A voice held. I spun around, the sound sending a jolt of terror through my body. But there was no one there. The room was still as quiet as it had been when I first entered. I thought maybe it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks after a long day. But no. The voice, clear, faint, but unmistakable, had come from Daniel. I could feel my hands trembling as I continued my work, but the voice lingered in my mind, echoing with the faintest sense of urgency. Help. It wasn't the kind of thing a grieving family would whisper over a loved one. No, it was something else. Something that didn't belong in this room. I leaned in closer to examine Daniel's face. His eyes were closed, and his mouth was shut. No visible signs of movement, but there was something about his expression, a subtle tightness in his jaw, like he was trying to hold something in. I stood there, frozen, staring at him, my mind racing. What was going on? Was I losing my grip on reality? I checked the body again. His fingers were still twitching, now more pronounced. They were no longer just curling. They were gripping the fabric of his clothes, pulling, as if he were trying to pull himself up. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. I wanted to finish the embalming. I needed to finish it. But something held me there. The unease, the fear, the sense that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the lights above me flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. The fluorescent hum intensified, buzzing in a way that felt unnatural. I turned toward the light, watching as the shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally. And then, for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, heart pounding, but nothing was there. The room was still. The body on the table, however, was not. Daniel's chest had risen. Barely perceptible, but it had risen. His breathing had stopped, and yet it seemed as though he was taking a shallow breath, like he was trying to inhale but couldn't. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. I checked the body again, praying that I was just tired, overworked, and imagining things. But it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. There was something wrong. The body was changing before my eyes. A subtle shift, a deepening of the pallor in his skin, as though the embalming fluid wasn't working fast enough. Or worse, maybe it was working too much. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't afford to lose focus, but the more I tried to focus on the task, the more I felt it, the pressure in the room, the weight in the air. It was like something was pushing against me, making it hard to breathe, to think. Then, with a sudden jolt, Daniel's fingers clenched again so tightly that the skin around his knuckles went white. And then, I heard it again, that voice, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. Please help me. The room seemed to close in on me. The lights flickered, and I could swear the air was colder, heavier. The words reverberated through the room, like they were coming from somewhere deep within him. I could barely breathe, barely think. My instincts told me to get out of there, to run, but I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed by fear, rooted to the spot as I stared at the body on the table, whose hands were now moving in slow, deliberate motions, like they were reaching for something or someone. And then, as I watched in horror, his eyes fluttered open, but they weren't his eyes. They were dark, empty, like something had taken hold of him and was now controlling him from the inside out. In that moment, I knew it. Daniel wasn't gone. He hadn't left. And whatever was left of him was trying to find a way to speak. I ran from the room, the lights flickering behind me as I bolted through the hall. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, gasping for air. I never went back to that prep room. Never finished Daniel's I don't know what happened in that room, but every night since, I hear it whispers in the dark, calling for help, and I can't escape the feeling that something is still watching me, still waiting. The phone call came just after midnight. It was one of those late-night cases that usually doesn't stand out, the kind ID handled hundreds of times. A man found dead in his apartment. A suspected heart attack. No trauma. no signs of foul play. But something about the call, the urgency in the voice of the officer, made me uneasy. They needed the body moved tonight. The family wanted a quick viewing. When I arrived, the apartment was as silent as the grave. The only sound, the faint hum of the air conditioning. The lights flickered slightly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to dismiss it, focusing on my task. The man was in his early 50s, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face frozen in a calm expression, as if he'd merely drifted into sleep. I checked the paperwork. Heart attack, no foul play, confirmed by the coroner. Everything was in order. As I lifted the body onto the gurney, the faintest sensation crept up my spine, but I shoved it away. I had work to do. The body bag was heavy with his weight, and as I zipped it up, I felt an odd resistance, as though the body were pushing against it. It didn't make sense. It was just the pressure of the bag, I told myself. The drive to the funeral home was uneventful. The usual night shift, the quiet hum of the engine, the lonely roads. When I arrived, I moved the body to the prep room. It was always eerily quiet in there. The stillness of the room, amplifying the faint sounds of my footsteps and the creak of the gurney wheels. I laid him down on the table, his body cold and stiff. As I unzipped the body bag, I was struck by the smell. It wasn't the usual odor of a body that had been sitting for a while. The sickly sweet scent of decomposition. No, this was different. It was a sharp, chemical scent like burnt plastic, mixed with something metallic. I shook it off. The body was freshly dead, after all. It wasn't unusual to encounter odd smells in this line of work, but the longer I worked, the more pronounced it became. The smell clung to the air, hanging in the room, making it feel thick, suffocating. It was as if the room itself was absorbing the scent, becoming part of it. I started the embalming process, checking his veins, preparing the fluids. But as I injected the solution, something strange happened. The man's body shifted, not a twitch, not a reflex, but a distinct movement. It was subtle at first, like the shift of a limb, but it was enough to make me pause. His fingers moved, slowly, but deliberately. They curled. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned in, trying to get a better look. His hand, which had been limped, was now clenched. His fingers, stiff with rigor mortis, seemed to be reaching for something. I backed away, trying to calm my nerves. It must have been some kind of muscle reaction. Maybe I hadn't properly checked his posture, or perhaps the embalming fluid was reacting with his body in some unexpected way. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the unease stayed. I glanced down at the man's face. His eyes were closed, but they weren't shut tightly, as if something was holding them open. And then, as I stood there, frozen, I saw it. His mouth opened just slightly enough for me to see the faintest movement of his lips. I leaned closer, thinking I was losing my mind, but there it was again. A word, just barely audible. Help. I froze, the word slicing through the stillness of the room. No, this couldn't be happening. He was dead. This wasn't possible. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. I checked for any signs of air in his lungs, any reason for this strange occurrence. But there was nothing. No reason for his mouth to move, no reason for his fingers to twitch, no reason for his body to react in the way it was. I turned to the embalming machine, desperately trying to focus on the task at hand. I couldn't let my imagination run wild. But as I turned back to the table, I saw the man's hand, still clenched, was slowly moving towards his chest. It wasn't a random movement, it was deliberate. It was as if he was trying to pull himself up. I stepped closer, my pulse racing. His skin was cold and stiff. There was no reason for this to be happening, no logical explanation. And yet, his hand was moving, inch by inch, toward his chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave the room. One had to get out of there. I bolted for the door, but as I passed by the body one last time, the lights above flickered, casting an eerie, erratic glow on the man's body. His eyes snapped open wide, unblinking and locked onto mine. The room seemed to contract around me. The smell became overwhelming, suffocating. The metallic scent mixed with something else, nausing sour, like blood. I stumbled back, panic setting in. His eyes wide, lifeless eyes followed me as I backed away. And then I heard it again. Not just a whisper, but a low, gurgling voice, barely a rasp. Please. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew one thing for sure. The man on the table, the body I had been preparing, wasn't finished. The next morning, when I returned to check on the body, everything was calm again. The lights were steady, the smell had dissipated, but as I stood there, staring down at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind in that room. A lingering presence, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I never spoke about it to anyone, not to my colleagues, not to the family, but every time I step into that prep room, I can feel it. The weight in the air, the eyes watching me from the table, and sometimes, when the lights flicker, I hear that voice again, soft, weak, but unmistakable, please. And I wonder if I ever really left that room, if I ever really left the body behind. The call came in just before 11 p.m. A man in his late 60s, found dead in his home. Natural causes, the dispatcher said. His wife had found him in the living room, slumped over in his chair. There was no sign of trauma, no foul play, nothing suspicious. Just another routine call, another body to be moved, another life to be preserved for a family that couldn't let go. But from the moment I entered the house, something felt different. The house was old, the kind of place that creaks with age. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air smelled stale, like dust and mildew. I stepped inside, adjusting to the dim light, the only source of illumination coming from a flickering lamp in the corner. His wife, Mary, was sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying, her face etched with the kind of sorrow you couldn't hide, no matter how hard you tried. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, offering my condolences. She nodded silently, wiping her eyes. The man was in the chair, his body cold, his face pale. I couldn't see his expression clearly. As if he had been stiffened into that position unnaturally, like a mannequin. I couldn't explain it, but it gave me an unsettling feeling. "We just want to prepare him for the funeral," Mary said, her voice quivering. I nodded, trying to push aside the unease. I was here to do a job, and a job was what I would do. I gently lifted the man's body and placed him onto the gurney. The moment I touched him, I felt a shiver run through me, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something in the air. It was as though the room itself had shifted, a subtle change I couldn't quite place. As I wheeled the body to the van, I tried to shake off the feeling. It was just a job, but even as I drove to the funeral home, something gnawed at the back of my mind. The van was silent, except for the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional creak of the gurney. When I got to the prep room, I moved the body onto the cold steel table. That's when I noticed something strange. The man's hands. They were clenched tightly into fists, but they shouldn't have been. He was dead, and rigor mortis had already set in. His hands should have been limp, relaxed, but they weren't. They were clenched with such force that the muscles in his arms were visibly straining. I stepped back, confused, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was a medical reason for it, but no, that didn't make sense. I had prepared hundreds of bodies in my career, and I had never seen this. I placed my hands on his, trying to gently open his fingers, but they wouldn't move. It was like they were frozen in place. I pressed harder, but the fingers stayed shut. I couldn't explain it. I'd seen stiff bodies, but this wasn't right. It was as though someone was holding onto those hands from the inside. A chill ran down my spine. My breath came out in sharp, quick bursts. I had to finish the embalming. I couldn't leave it like this. I tried to steady my hands as I prepared the embalming solution, pushing my discomfort to the back of my mind. But as I began the process, the strangest thing happened. The lights above flickered, and for a brief moment, the room went dark. When they came back on, I saw the man's mouth was open just slightly but enough to reveal something dark, something wrong. His teeth were showing, and his lips were pulled back in a grotesque, unnatural grimace. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. This was impossible. It had to be. I leaned in closer, my eyes locked on his face. His eyes, those empty, glassy eyes, seemed to shift, ever so slightly, as though they were focusing on me. But it couldn't be. He was dead. He was supposed to be dead. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. A voice coming from his throat. I stumbled back, my body frozen in terror. The words were so faint, so ragged, that I wasn't sure if I had imagined them. But no, I had heard them. His voice. His dead voice. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the chill so intense that I could see my breath fogging in the air. The man's body, once still, seemed to move, not in the way a living body moves, but in an unnatural, jerky way. His fingers, those tight, clenched, fists relaxed for the briefest moment, and then, without warning, they clenched again, even tighter than before. My pulse raced. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. I had to finish. I had to complete the embalming. But I couldn't touch him anymore. I couldn't get close. I backed away, my hands shaking as I grabbed the syringe, trying to finish the embalming as quickly as possible. But the moment I touched his body again, I felt it. A pressure, like a hand, not mine, but something else, pressing down on my chest. The room seemed to close in around me. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. The darkness in the room was absolute, thick and suffocating. The whisper came again, louder this time, almost as if it was right in my ear. Leave. I felt a surge of panic. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the floor, my heart racing in my chest. The whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent, more desperate. I could hear his voice clearly now, though I couldn't understand the words. But one thing was clear. He didn't want me there. He didn't want me to finish my work. He was angry. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself to my feet and stumbled toward the door, not daring to look back. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered back on, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest, but the air still felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I never finished the embalming. I couldn't. I left the body where it lay, not even bothering to lock the room behind me. I couldn't go back in there, not after what happened. The next day, the body was gone. The room was spotless. Nothing had been disturbed. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. The man wasn't gone. He wasn't finished, and I'm not sure if he ever will be. And I never went back to that prep room again. Not for a long time. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear the whispers again. Soft, ragged, and unmistakable. Believe me, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, do not forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories, and remember, sometimes the scariest tailies are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next video if you dare.